We'll wait a few more seconds so everybody can join. Okay. Just a moment. Okay, we'll start. Good evening. My name is Noam and I'm from Moreshet. I am pleased to welcome you to the fourth event of the second series of webinars, Polish Talk Mondays with Jewish Historical Institute. This special program is a cooperation between Moreshet, Mordechai Anielewicz Memorial Education and Research Center, the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, the Association of Israeli Guides and Leaders of Delegations to Poland and Commemoration of the Holocaust, and the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute. Before we start, we would like to express our solidarity with the Ukrainian people and their struggle for freedom. Tomorrow we mention International Women's Day, and this is an important reminder that many of the refugees are women and children. This evening, we are hosting Dr. Katarzyna Person, who will speak about women of the Ringelblum archive. We'll have 40 minutes of presentation and then approximately 15 minutes for questions. When we get to the questions session, please submit your questions via the Q&A button on your screen and not via the chat. Dr. Katarzyna Person is a historian of Eastern Europe, European Jewish history, working in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Currently, 2020-2022 Maria Curie Fellow at the Ludwig Maximilians Universitet in Munich. She has held fellowships, among others, in Yad Vashem, the Centers for Jewish History in New York, and the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich. She has published on history of Jews in Poland during the Holocaust and in the immediate post-war period. Her next book, co-written with Johannes Dieter Steinert, on the concentration camp for children in Łódź, will be published in 2022 by Palgrave Macmillan in the Holocaust and its Context series. Dr. Person, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me do the most tricky part of sharing my screen, and it worked. Hello, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here, and I'm really happy to be talking about this today in the context of what you just spoke of, firstly and foremostly, and but also because today is the anniversary of, not the anniversary is the right word, but today is the day on which Bunker Kusha was discovered, a bunker in which Emanuel Ringelblum was hiding together with his wife and son in 1944, was discovered on this day, and a few days later, Ringelblum and his family were murdered. So this is in many ways an important day, and a good day to speak about Ringelblum Archive and remembering what he did and why it was so important. So I'll be speaking today about the role of women in the Ringelblum Archive and women who were part of the Ringelblum Archive and how their experiences were portrayed and were depicted in the archive. I will, sorry, oops, something really good, sorry. Now I need help, I think.
What happened?
Something happened with the, there we go, sorry. And now it's also something really weird with the screen. Oh, there we go, sorry. Okay, now we're good. So we'll be talking about how women, the role played by women during the archive, and also how their experiences were portrayed in the Ringelblum Archive. I know you already had quite a few lectures about the archive itself and about its functioning, so I probably don't have to say much about it. I'll be speaking, so I'll say just a couple of sentences as an introduction. The Ringelblum Archive, set up by Emanuel Ringelblum, historian, social activist, teacher, who with the closure of the ghetto, of Warsaw Ghetto in the autumn of 1940, decided to set up an underground research group, documentational group, the aim of which was to document Jewish history during the Holocaust. First documented, that was the first stage of it. The second stage of it was analyzing it, writing Jewish history, a history that was written by Jews and for Jews. That was what was called a 2.5 year project. And then the third part of it was informing the world about what's happening and passing on information to the underground about Axel Reinhardt and the progress of the Holocaust. The archive was hidden in the summer of 1942, the first part, the second part in early 1943, and then uncovered in 1946, the first part, 1950, the second part. And from then on, it remains to this day probably the most important, one of the most important sources regarding social and demographic changes during the Holocaust, communal life during the Holocaust, and one of the best example of resistance during the Holocaust, spiritual resistance and resistance through research during the Holocaust. And an important part in the archive was played by women. And this wasn't, oops, sorry. I'm sorry, I have to start. Something really, let's try it again. Oh, there we go. I'm really sorry. This is what never happened before, but there you go. So as I said, important roles were played by women, and this wasn't by chance. It was actually part of Ringelblum's conscious decision to write full story of the Holocaust. That was actually one of the key aims of the archive, was to write as complete as possible story of what was happening to the Jewish community during the Holocaust, and that included also the role of women. So we really have women's involvement in the Holocaust in the Ringelblum archive on 3 levels. The first one is the way in which archives talks about women's experience of the Holocaust as part of the community. Secondly, the way in which it depicted specific women's experience of the Holocaust, including specific violence aimed at women, including also sexual violence. And thirdly, by looking at experiences to which women had specific access, by which I mean, for example, employing teachers, female teachers from schools to talk about children, or employing women who work as carers in a point for refugee children to talk about their experiences, speaking to, for example, actresses who work from theater, waitresses, and so on and so on. So jobs which were mainly aimed at women, mainly performed by women, who also contributed their voice to the archive. So in that sense, women's voice and women's specific experiences are very much present in the archive. And of course, when we speak about women in the archive, we mainly speak about Rochel Auerbach. We can see here that's undoubtedly the most famous woman who was part of the archive. And I understand there was already a lecture about her, which was held by Karolina Szymaniak. So in this lecture, I won't be speaking much about Rochel Auerbach, even though she was an absolutely fascinating person, a writer, an essayist, historian, of course, one of the 3 survivors of the Ringelblum archive, one of the driving forces behind recovery of the archive, later head of the Department of the Collection of Witness Testimony in Yad Vashem, and before that in the ghetto, a director of the soup kitchen and the author of a very famous diary, which you can see here, one of possibly most famous documents from the Ringelblum archive, a document of extreme literary quality, a very personal, very intimate story of her life and her experiences in the Warsaw Ghetto, and after that also famously one of people who collected testimonies from escapees from Treblinka, and then now for a reportage in Treblinka after the war. So a woman who really contributed greatly to our understanding of the Holocaust. But as I said, also a woman who's been spoken of and written of quite extensively. So what I want to do today is look at also at other women who are also part of the archive, and who also, I think, should be remembered, especially on this day. About many of them, we don't know as much as we do about Roch, but the woman which I'd like to start with is Cecilia Sobakova. And this is because she's the author of what is undoubtedly the most, maybe undoubtedly, but I think the most important study regarding women in the ghetto. Cecilia Sobakova, who was born around 1900 in Vilna, came from a family of Russian-speaking Jews. She very much belonged to the intellectual elite, first in Vilna, then in Warsaw, where she lived. She had a daughter. She was married to an engineer who was working on film production, and she was a writer. She was a journalist writing essays for newspapers, but also a translator, and not just a translator, but she was the person who translated Szymon Dubnow's 12-volume Jewish history from Russian to Polish. So she was extremely accomplished before the war as an intellectual. She also held a very important and popular salon, how do you say it, a literary salon where intellectuals met and discussed the works. She held it before the war, famously at Elektoralna Street, and then held it once the war broke out as well. We don't know if that continued in the ghetto or not. We don't really know anything about her life in the ghetto, which also shows you how little we know about people who are part of the Ringelblum archive. Considering her background, you would expect to know more about her, but we don't. What we know about her is what she left in the Ringelblum archive, and that is her study of women in the ghetto. That study, which is now also available in English, if you're interested in the English edition of the Ringelblum archive, is a series of 17 interviews with women from the ghetto and with women coming from all walks of life. So what she aims to do is she chooses 17 women and speaks to them about their life, beginning with the official beginning of the war, because in each case, the personal war, we can say, started at a bit different time. They were affected by war very differently, depending on the background, depending on the financial situation, depending on the links to the so-called Aryan side. But she starts in September 1939 and then takes them in the conversation up to the point when the interview is conducted. And that's in the spring of 1942, because those interviews were part of what I already spoke of, so part of the 2.5-year project, the aim of which was to look at specific aspects of life in the ghetto and look at them in depth. So she's looking at life of women in the ghetto. What is fascinating about those interviews is firstly the broad base, social base of women she speaks to. She speaks to a corset maker who turned into a smuggler. She speaks to a daughter of a restaurant owner who began working as a prostitute. She spoke to an intellectual who speaks 4 languages and in the ghetto works in a factory. She speaks to a librarian. She speaks to a cleaner. She speaks to a refugee. She speaks to a woman who is selling vegetables on the street. Some of them come from what at that point could be described as the ghetto middle class, in the sense that they're not starving or they're not dying of hunger yet. Some of them are dying, and when she speaks to them, it's very clear that these really are the last moments, and also the only way in which those voices could be preserved, because they're not necessarily women who would necessarily become part of studies of life in the ghetto. And what is truly fascinating is the way in which she shows them as women who are fighting for survival. She's looking at their choices very objectively. She's not judging them. Whatever choices they make in order to survive, she describes in a very empathetic, very understanding language. She writes, and I quote now, "It seems certain and beyond any doubt that the current war has predestined the Jewish woman to become a winner of life." And she says it in the same way about a woman who has to work as a prostitute as she does about a woman who's very highly educated and works as a librarian. So this series of interviews, which are very much in the spirit of Ivo, on which Ringelblum's work is based, in this tradition of researching the present to change the future is one of the, I think, for me personally, one of the most important documents in the Ringelblum archive, and so I want to start with it as well, but also ones which are, I think, crucial if we have to understand anything about life in the Warsaw Ghetto and changes which are which the community under such duress is undertaking. The second person I'd like to speak of, and this is also a great example of how past life, let's say, so life from before the war influences choices and situation in the ghetto, is Henny Hawarth. Henny Hawarth was born in 1909 in Warsaw. So 1909, she was in her early 30s once the ghetto was closed. She was a graduate of Warsaw University, an extremely accomplished poet already at a very early age. She published very well received volumes. She was also a passionate book collector, a member of the Union of Polish Writers. So by all means, for a person that young, she was already very accomplished, on the brink of a great career when the war started. In the ghetto, she became involved in social work. She was working with Centos, which was an organization which took place of children. And Emanuel Ringelblum, who was involved in social self-help, actually found a job for her and offered her a job of preparing publicity material for Jewish self-help. So she was using her talent from pre-war and her skills to write publicity material for Jewish self-help. And Emanuel Ringelblum wrote about her. Her propaganda materials, posters, appeals, letters, etc., were characterized by kind, light, and simple style. They were effective due to their simplicity and sincerity, because the poet wrote them in blood, straight from her pained heart, so very sensitive to the terrible suffering of the Jewish masses. And when he introduced her to Onek Shabbat and brought her to work in Onek Shabbat, he actually asked her to write about people she was meeting and coming across in her work in social help, especially about refugees. And what she specialized in was writing about fate of individual Jewish families. So she was trying to distill those individual stories from statistics and from those masses of people she was meeting, and for the archive, she wrote individual stories. And to quote Ringelblum again, she started to write monographs on individual families, which moved readers to tears. She gave one of these to read to social activists who were closely familiar with the life of refugees, but they said that it was only the young writer who had opened their eyes to the terrible tragedy of each of tens of thousands of refugee families in Warsaw. So she was clearly using her talent to write documents which are now part of the Ringelblum archive. But aside from that, she kept writing poetry, and she's actually the author of one of the possibly one of the most famous poems which were written in the Warsaw Ghetto, which was extremely famous already at that point, and famously performed all around the ghetto and in ghettos, theaters, and cafes, among them by very well-known singer Adina Blumenfeld, who performed a song which was based on this poem. The poem was called The Little Smuggler and spoke about the fate of children who were involved in smuggling in the ghetto. And you can have it here, and I'll just read it out loud. Past rubble, fence barbed wire, past soldiers guarding the wall, starving but still defiant, I softly steal past them all. Clutching a bag of sacking with only rags to wear, with limbs numbed by winter and hearts numbed by despair. Emanuel Ringelblum wrote that she actually wrote much more than just that, and very often performed her poems at evenings in house committees and others. We know also that we don't know much about her life in the ghetto. We know that she was sick, and she had some problems with her lungs, and that she was in the ghetto with her mother, and she died most likely following her mother to the Umschlagplatz. And I will again quote Ringelblum, who wrote, "Was Wertówna had a lung disease, but without a lot of cash, without some 10,000 zloty, it was futile to dream of the iron side. Was Wertówna had many Polish friends, yet no one stepped forward to save her. During the first deportation, she perished in Treblinka with her mother. At the Umschlagplatz, they tried to save her from going to a train car, but they did not want or could not release her mother. Henryka Wertówna was well aware that deportation meant death, but she followed her mother anyway." So this was Henryka Wertówna, another really, I think, interesting and incredible life stories, which also shows you a little bit how, when we think of the Ringelblum archive and really think of Ringelblum, how many precious and interesting and incredibly important life stories, just like that of the young poet, were part of those who created the archive. And this is the next one who was involved in the archive, Salome Ostroska. Again, someone like that we don't know much about. Actually, we know less about her than about any of the previous women. But she's important here because she was, again, brought in because of her profession. She was the head of quarantine at Leszno Street. It was a large quarantine where people were brought in when arriving into the ghetto in order to spend a period of time there because of the typhus epidemic. It was also a place where people were taken if their house was being disinfected during the disinfection action. And quarantines were indeed places of violence, places where people came already impoverished, places of hunger, and those who run them, like Salome Ostroska, really had to be, well, superheroes to be able to provide for those who were locked into the quarantine. And in case of Ostroska, as I said, we know nothing about her, other than we know that she had a very neat handwriting and she wrote in Polish. And this is really what we know about so many of the collaborators of Ringelblum archive. We can vaguely talk about their education through how they wrote. But in her case, I want to, and also think that's fitting today, to read to you some excerpts from her work, which actually come from February 1941, in which she writes about her daily job, and she writes about what work in the quarantine looked like. And I read to you. Written February 1941, night and day, Jews from Polish towns and villages keep arriving on trains, carriages, buses. They leave behind their homes, built over years of effort and hard work to face hunger, poverty, and unemployment. The quarantine is the threshold of the new life. The spacious room of the former school are great with dirt, dust, and human exertions. Travel weary, hungry, they arrive in a place where they receive a cup of coffee and some bread, if it is available. And later on the same month, she writes, an individual person disappears in this giant human mass. People are crowded. One cannot tell one face from another. Yet still everyone has their own problems and challenges. Everyone has requests, which we cannot respond to. Everybody is hungry and asking for bread. Mother asks for food for the children, milk or water, with sugar for babies. Unfortunately, we often don't have bread, no milk, no sugar. Later on, she writes quite long, but I think it's important that we're in today. Says, knocking on the door, bath guard comes in. There are about 70 people in the bath, mostly children. They are so hungry that he's too afraid to let them into the bath. We still have some semolina, so two ladies go to the kitchen to cook it and give it to the children. And the last passage, an ambulance parked in front of the quarantine. They are taking away the sick and the elderly. They're leading an elderly man. He has no shoes on. Assistants say that his daughter took away his shoes because she believes that it would be a pity to lose the shoes, and her father won't survive anyway. Just as importantly, in the quarantine, Ostroska met with people who went to forced labor camps. And she also became, through that, and now for one of the most important testimonies she was collecting testimonies from forced labor camp for the Ringelblum archive. She was also collecting testimonies from September 1939, and she was also collecting stories which were shared by Jews who escaped from the east after the German invasion in the summer of 1941. So it shows you a woman who we don't really know much about, but we can see here through her work and through her writing as someone who's working at the bottom of ghetto hell, basically, and who at the same time still had enough strength to collect those documents, to collect those stories, to collect those testimonies, and provide Ringelblum archive with them and safekeep them for future generations. We don't know anything about, as I said, about Salome Ostroska. We don't know how she died, when she died. We really don't know anything. And this is the next woman, Gustawa Jarecka, who is, again, an example of someone coming from a completely different place and also doing something completely different in the ghetto. Gustawa Jarecka was born in 1908 in Kalisz. She studied at Warsaw University, and she was, again, a very accomplished writer. She was born in 1908, so 31 years old when the war broke out, in her early 30s in the ghetto. And she already at that point was the author of 4 novels, which were dedicated to working class, and also numerous essays and numerous short stories, which were widely published in Polish Jewish press and also socialist press, Polish communist press before the war. She was also a teacher of Polish language, and by all means, someone who was possibly felt more at home in Polish than in Yiddish, and she definitely was came from a very strongly acculturated background. So she was a bit different than the woman we spoke of before. She was also a woman who spoke very good German, and as such, she got a job in the Judenrat. So she was an employee in the Jewish Council, again, a place which we would not necessarily associate with people who would be close to Ringelblum's circle, and we wouldn't necessarily think that someone who works even as a typist in the Judenrat would be a choice for someone who, like Jarecka, would play such an important part in the Ringelblum archive. But what she did was she collected documents and copies of documents from the Judenrat, from the Jewish Council, and then she passed them on to Emanuel Ringelblum. We know quite a lot about her from Marcel Reich-Ranicki, a famous literary critic who lived after the war in Germany and who worked together with her. And he left in his memoirs quite a few reflections on Jarecka, who he was very fond of. So we know uniquely, really, because there's not many people that we know so much about, but we do know about her everyday life and about her work in the ghetto. He wrote, "I can see her in front of me, a chestnut-haired, blue-eyed, slim woman in her early 30s, calm and quiet. She made a big impression on me from the start. Literature brought us together. We were talking about the French and the Russians, about Flaubert, Proust, and Tolstoy. I owed a lot to these conversations." We also know from Ranicki that in the ghetto, she was a single mother. She had 2 sons, her first son from her first marriage, and then the second son from a later relationship. So we know that her situation could not have been easy. A woman who would be bringing up 2 children on her own undoubtedly was in an extremely difficult position. Nonetheless, she managed to avoid the first deportation, probably because of her work in the Judenrat. She wasn't taken in the summer of 1942, and the result of that is her very famous essay, and again, one of the most famous documents in the Ringelblum archive, entitled "The Last Stage of Resettlement is Death." This is the essay which is extremely often quoted when we speak about the Ringelblum archive and when we speak about documents there. This essay depicts the first stage of deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. It is very emotional, it's beautifully written, but at the same time, it also uses German documents, it quotes German documents which Jarecka has access to. So it's a very, maybe not strange, but a very evocative and very powerful essay. And when she wrote about writing it, she wrote, "These notes are driven by an instinct, a desire to leave a mark, by despair, close to crying sometimes, and from a will to justify one's life, remaining in deadly uncertainty. We have nooses on our necks, and when they loosen a little, we shout out." And I will, and this is probably the most, one of the most famous passages from that essay, in which she writes about the summer 1942 action. And she writes, "We know the proof of guilt, which is useless for ourselves. The trace should be thrown like a stone under the wheel of history," possibly the most famous part of the archive. "In order to stop it, the stone has a weight of our experience, which had reached the bottom of human cruelty. It contains the memories of mothers mad with grief after losing their children, a memory of the cry of children who were carried to the road to death without coats in the summer clothes, barefoot and walked crying, unaware of the horror which was happening to them, a memory of despair of old mothers and fathers who had to be abandoned by the adult children, and the stone silence in a dead city, once a sentence on 300,000 people was implemented." This document, which is written on which is actually written on 4 typewriters. And we see it, so it was written, so we can see how she was writing it. It ends mid-sentence. We don't know why it does so. She probably didn't have enough time. So she finished halfway through and deposited it in the archive itself. We know from Ranicki that Gustawa Jarecka, who was very much part of the Polish community and had the so-called good appearance and also many friends outside the ghetto, was given a help to escape, but of course that help did not involve her 2 sons. Ranicki, she died on the 18th of January. She was taken out of the ghetto on the 18th of January, so in the January action. And Ranicki, who was with her in the column of people led to the Umschlagplatz, wrote, "Jarecka and her children were there as well. I made a sign to Gustawa Jarecka, who stood in our line with her 2 children, that want to run away, and that she should join us. She nodded. I was about to run, but I stopped for a second, afraid of being shot. Tosia," that's Ranicki's wife, "pulled me away from the line and we ran towards the gate of the house of the Dieremiła Street, destroyed in September 1939. Gustawa Jarecka didn't run with us. She died with her 2 children in a train to Treblinka." And we have other testimonies as well, which say that she already died on the train, most likely due to lack of access to her, together with her 2 sons. And now one last person, and that's again someone who's very widely and often associated with the Ringelblum archive because of her works, which are left in the archive, but who herself was not part of the group. Her works were actually deposited in the archive by her husband, by Israel Lichtenstein, but nonetheless I thought she should also be spoken of and she should also be mentioned today, and that's of course Galia Ssekstein, a painter, an artist, who was born in 1907 in Warsaw. So again, like most of these women that we spoke of, and there's really many collaborators of Ringelblum archive, during her work for the archive and during her time in the ghetto, again her early 30s. She also had a little daughter who was born in 1940. So just in the autumn of 1940, just as the ghetto was being sealed off. Her daughter Margaret was born. Galia Ssekstein was a painter who already showed great talent for painting from an early age. She came from a working class family, but as her talent was discovered quite early, she received scholarships and she was studying first in Krakow. And then she lived in Warsaw with her husband, social activist and politician, teacher, general leader, Israel Lichtenstein, a very charismatic man. She became famous mainly for her portraits of children, which are now part of the Ringelblum archive in the ghetto. She worked with children. As I said, Lichtenstein was involved with education. She was teaching art before the war, and she continued to do so, most likely in the ghetto. She was looking after her little daughter, her newborn daughter, and continued to teach art in children corners and in ghetto school. We don't know much more about her daily life in the ghetto, but what we do know is that Emanuel Ringelblum asked her husband to, together with his two students, hide the Ringelblum archive. He gave her one of the boxes, and in those boxes she placed her picture, which are now her pictures, a collection of pictures which are now part of the archive, and again one of the most evocative part of the Ringelblum archive. She also left her last will, which I think will work as a good ending to this lecture today. And in her last will, which she placed together with the last will of her husband and those of David Graber and Nahum Grzywacz, were the two students hiding the archive, she wrote, "I stand on the border between life and death, certain that I will not remain alive. I wish to take leave from my works, from my friends, and my works I bequeath to the Jewish Museum to be built after the war. Farewell, my friends. Farewell, the Jewish people. Never again such a catastrophe." And I think this will be probably the good ending to this, to what I'm speaking about today. And what I really wanted to show you through showing you those women who were part of the archive and maybe are not as famous as Rochel Auerbach and Bluma Wassel, the other female who survived there, who was one of the three survivors of the archive, is that the diversity of their lives, how different they were, how similar in many ways, but also how very different. And it's really how important it was to bring their voices in the archive and to what extent the diversity of their voices contributed to this great enterprise, which was the Ringelblum archive. Thank you.
Wow, very difficult testimonies. Thank you very much, Katarzyna. Now let's look what questions we got. To our audience, if you'd like to add questions, please use the Q&A. Maybe I'll start. You said about you just said about the diversity, but is there something that can characterize or bring together the women in the Ringelblum archive or the role, or in a different words, what can we learn from a gender perspective of this archive?
I think a lot. In a sense, and especially when it comes to Cecilia Sobakova's study, which I mentioned at the beginning, Ringelblum did, I think, put a lot of impact on studying specific women's experience of war. Cecilia Sobakova's study is an extremely, I would say, modern, I think, to this day, really, look at how women experience war, in what extent their experience is different than the experience of men. What is the specific violence they face, how they face it, how they react to it, what role they play in the family dynamics, what role is played by the changing gender roles in the ghetto, in the family dynamics by women's work and so on and so on. So in that sense, I think this is really a really key element of the archive, is that it does incorporate women's experience to this extent. And as I said, it's very modern. I think it took many years for historians to be able to actually look at this experience and discuss it with the openness and seriousness which the Ringelblum archive discussed it with. And I think it's important. I think it's also important because when we often read Ringelblum himself, or even Abraham Levin or other key male men who were part of the archive, we often find in the pages of their diaries quite stereotypical look at women and stereotypical look at gender roles. And we can see that their personal views often were representative of the age in which they grew up and of their times, right? In a way that some things which they write about women's appearance or about reactions or about changing gender roles in the ghettos are not necessarily something that we would today agree with or find acceptable. But nonetheless, it's through incorporating women's voices who are allowed or given a voice to speak about themselves and speak about their own experiences. This really is a extremely, I think, important. Yes, this is such an important collection also because of that.
Thank you. Dvora Geller asked, how can we read up more about these incredible women? Any book or on the market?
That's a great question because there is so little about them really. As there is really little about other people who are involved in the Ringelblum archive, unfortunately, that's a testament to how little we know about, how much was destroyed and how little we know about those people. They are described in, of course, written by Samuel Kassow in Who Will Write Our History, in his seminal book on the Ringelblum archive. Samuel Kassow does write extensively about women as well, and attempts to put together their individual life stories. So that's an important source. We now have Cecilia Sobakova's specific studies in the first English volume of Ringelblum archive, which is available online on the Jewish Historical Institute website. So if you're interested in reading English translation of this whole diary, you can find it there. But so far, there hasn't really been, I think, other than individual articles, anything written about women in the Ringelblum archive as a proper monograph or proper study. And I think it's definitely time for that now.
Okay. Was there a difference between the education of men and women? I think it's more like a general question.
There was undoubtedly before the war, yes. And to an extent, this the women's contribution to the archive shows it very clearly that women who were part of the archive, well, I don't want to generalize, but to a great degree wrote in Polish because they were educated often in Polish state school rather than religious schools. They were educated in Polish state schools. Again, we can't really see those women who I spoke of as representatives of the wider community. We don't have any religious women, for example, here, of course. Women coming from religious community. There were those women who I spoke of are all graduates of university, not all, but most of them graduated from university. They often published already before the war, so they were already part of the intellectual elite, let me say, before the war. They were not necessarily really representatives of the community as such. They made an effort to speak to women from all walks of life, like Cecilia Sobakova did. So in that sense, those very different voices which wouldn't otherwise be preserved are preserved through their work and through their outreach and through their specific choice to speak to, for example, women who are refugees from smaller towns, women who are religious, or women who are not necessarily coming from their intellectual circles, but they themselves were for their generation very highly educated and also experienced in writing before the war as well.
Tom Navon asked, how is the participation of women in the political underground in the ghetto reflected in the archive?
That's a great question, of course. And it is because we have, of course, mainly through underground newspapers, and whatever was written by women for the underground newspapers is very much there in that sense. And we also know of reports by women and that in that way, but those women which I spoke of course, were not really part of the underground. They were older, firstly, because they were already in their 30s. They usually had children, and they were involved in the Ringelblum archive more in spiritual resistance, I would say, than actual resistance. But there are, of course, also with voices of female members of the underground, as they are of underground in general. I mean here, future armed underground, right, or underground groups. And yeah, I think Maria Ferenc wrote about it as
well. Let's see. What can we learn from the archive about the challenges of motherhood in the ghetto?
A lot. We can learn a lot through the women who are part of it, because basically all of those, most of those, not most, but many of those who I mentioned were mothers and had children. But this is mainly this is probably the key part of Cecilia Sobakova's study, is what happens when those women are pretty much left on their own. Sometimes when you read this study by Cecilia Sobakova, you think to what extent it actually reflects, fully reflects family dynamics in the ghetto, because she does choose women who are very strong, who are usually caring for the children on their own. There's very few men in that study, actually. If they are, they usually are, I would say dead, but they either disappear, or they go to the east, or they somehow leave those women alone. So the women who were part of those 17 interviews by Sobakova, the majority of them are actually alone with their children. And the children are the driving force behind what they do. And this is also Sobakova's reflection, which comes across very clearly in her work, is that the children are really the driving force behind what they do, and the reason for survival in many ways, because they do face incredible challenges, and the main reason why they overcome is because of the children. We have mothers there, but we also have, of course, carers, and this is another important part of the archive when it comes to women's experience, are those really touching, and I don't know if touching is the right word at all, but very hard-hitting essays written by young girls, teenagers really at that point, who are working in, often teenagers or women in their early 20s, who are working in refugee points, organizing care for children of refugees. So this is another aspect of looking after children, and they really are fully dedicated to organize this 1 hour a day for those children who are taken away from the horror and death and hunger of refugee points and put somewhere in the corner where they're meant to be learning. In reality, of course, they have no capacity to learn anything. It's more about keeping them away from what's happening around them. But they try to provide them with this hour a day or a couple of hours a day of childhood, really. So there are also essays by teachers. So there's the topic of children, looking after children as a driving force behind one's actions and sacrifices, not necessarily even one's own children, but other children, is something that appears a lot in the Ringelblum archive. And maybe I should add to it that it sounds like a very traditional gender look at women as those who are looking after children, but we can also see that women are actually crossing gender roles in order to provide for their children. So they're not depicted here as those mothers who sacrifice themselves. They're depicted here as women who are able to and who are willing to cross traditional gender norms in order to provide for the children, in order to provide food and living for the children. So it's also an important part of it.
There is, well, it's interesting to hear what you will say about it. Do we know how Ringelblum choose these women? So I don't know if he choose them or.
That's a good question. We know he chose Rahela Auerbach, right? Because he actually, we have a testimony of her being approached by him. But that's a great question. How did he choose others who are in the group? Partly because, though this is interesting actually, because I think none of the women I mentioned were actually part of his social circles before the war, right? when you speak about his closest collaborators, about men who work in the archive, such as Abraham Levin or others, we see people who worked with him before the war, who are in the same, like Heshvas, in the same political circles, who were in the party with him, who were involved in social work with him. But none of these women I mentioned actually was his acquaintance from before the war. So if he did choose them, or if someone else chose them, however their works reached the archive, or the documents reached the archive, it was probably because he saw the need to have women as part of the team. Some of them, like Salome Ostroska, for example, who wrote about the quarantine, we can assume she wasn't chosen because she was a woman. She was chosen because of her experience and work in the quarantine and of her specific professional, maybe it's not the right word, but her experience of specific experience of ghetto life. Others like Sobakova were chosen exactly because she was a woman and she was able to speak to other women and write about women's experience. So I think we have very different basis for it. But of course, there were people like Blumavase, for example, who I didn't have time to mention, Heshvas's wife, one of the 3 survivors, who was working as a copyist for the archive. So she was copying documents from Yiddish. She didn't contribute anything that was gender specific. She was purely one of the people very strongly, very heavily involved in archives, everyday life. And I think the fact that she was a woman didn't really play any role here. So we have really different aspects of it.
Okay, this is a different view now. Can you speak about women doctors and their contribution, please? Maria Cieselska's book on the doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto, coming out in English in May, mentions some key women. Most did not survive.
Yes, and now I'm trying to think which of them actually contribute to the archive. We do have definitely, there are essays on functioning of ghetto hospitals written by women, by those women who are high up in the field, in the thing. We also have in ghetto hospitals, we also have essays by other female doctors and by I think there's one by a nurse as well. So women who are involved in healthcare. But again, I think this is an example of women who write because of the professional standing, not because they are women. But again, as you said, a very important. This is a very important contribution. Yeah, again, as teachers, as carers, one of the professions where there were women involved and who contributed in the professional role to writing the story of the archive.
Sounds like you can take your next research from those questions.
Yeah, it's fascinating. They're really great questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I think you answered all the questions. So do you have something to add for closure, or?
I don't know. I think what I would really like to say that if someone would like to write a book about it, that would be fantastic, because this is really incredible stories. These really are and so little known as well. And I think if we did more archival research into this individual life stories, which don't really fit in many cases the stereotypical picture of Ringelblum archive that we have, I think that would be a great contribution to research in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Holocaust in general.
Yes, for sure. Thank you very much, and thank you all for taking part on this 4th event of our 2nd series. I would like to thank again to you, Dr. Katarzyna Persson, to the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Circle Institute, and especially Bartek Boris, and to the director Monika Krawczyk, to Julia Mackiewicz-Saban, and to acting director Katarzyna Dzierżawska from the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, to Gil Faran and the Association of Israeli Guides and Leaders of Delegation to Poland and Commemoration of the Holocaust, and to Moreshet, Mordechai Anielewicz Memorial Education and the Research Center. Keep safe, and we hope this war will end up soon and the refugees can carry on with their regular life. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.